Hello, friends, and welcome to our Friday evening monk chat, our regular program here offered to you from Empty Cloud Monastery here in New Jersey, live. And we have with us Venerable Satima, who is will introduce herself. She's a monastic who's been practicing for quite some time, and she is my older Dhamma sister, ordained right before me on the same day. We're both ordained here at Empty Cloud. And so very special opportunity to have her here. And is there anything that you would like to add?
Just really happy to be sitting with you tonight, and looking forward to sharing in the Dhamma talk with, looks like we have quite a few questions coming.
Yeah.
Looking forward to getting as many answered as possible. Welcome, everybody.
So yeah, we'll say hello to some of the people joining in live. We have Joseph, Joe, hope you're doing well, and also Anna, Mike, Kauser friends, Rick, Mary, who is just here, Richard from Bolivia, Gregory, Maria, and I'm sure many other people who are watching silently, lurking. So hello also to you. And we also have a live audience, well, an even more live audience. And so we will, at this time, render homage to the Buddha, our original teacher, and the reason that we have the opportunity to gather here and reflect on the different teachings. And then after that, we'll go ahead and begin answering the questions. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Saranang Gacchami. Okay, and our first question is from Joe, who says, "Warmest wishes, Venerables. Could you kindly share some guidance on how to practice this technique?" And it says that quoting from a sutta, I assume, that the Venerable Sariputta told the monks, "So then, if others abuse, revile, scold, and harass a monk, he understands thus: this painful feeling born of ear contact has arisen in me. That is dependent, not independent. Dependent on what? Dependent on contact. Then he sees that contact is impermanent, that feeling is impermanent, that perception is impermanent, that volitional activities are impermanent, and that consciousness is impermanent. And his mind, having made an element its objective support, enters into that new objective support and acquires confidence, steadiness, and resolution." And you say that you're looking specifically for guidance on the last part regarding elements and what it means to make an element the objective support for the mind and for the mind to enter into it. Could you please teach us? Would you like to get us started with this? Are you familiar with it? Okay. Okay.
You've been doing classes on this, I hear.
Okay, well, we did. Yeah, this is I think from the Majjhima Nikaya number 28, which I've talked about. I'm not sure if I've talked about it live in a little bit, but I've talked about it before. And so, yeah, this is a really wonderful sutta. For those who don't know, I really recommend that you read it. This is, as I mentioned, Majjhima Nikaya number 28, the Mahahatipādopama Sutta, the larger discourse on the simile of the elephant's footprint. And Venerable Sariputta, who is the Buddha's chief disciple in wisdom, the Buddha said that at best, so no one could ever surpass Sariputta's wisdom, Venerable Sariputta's wisdom. And in the sutta, you get to see his genius, his kind of inspirational, almost, to use kind of a little bit of a sort of not so official of a word, but almost like his freestyling of the Dhamma and how he puts that together and wraps it all together to make one big topic that covers all the different bases. And in the sutta, he starts by talking about the Four Noble Truths, and then he goes into the definition of the Four Noble Truths being the five aggregates, and he goes into the first aggregate, and then he talks about that in terms of the elements, and then he talks about the elements in terms of developing a perception of impermanence in regards to them, and then understanding the body, and then from the body understanding contact is dependent, and then he talks about dependent origination and the sense bases. So he covers the aggregates, the elements, the sense bases, and dependent origination, which are the main wisdom teachings that the Buddha offers. And so this part that you're quoting, this is kind of the culmination, or one part of that culmination, where he is wrapping together all those different teachings. So he's talking about dependent origination, about the sense fields, about the elements in the context of the aggregates and the noble truths. And he's kind of wrapping it together and giving a practical example of how someone might apply that teaching, specifically in the case of when we're getting abused or hit. And here he's talking about verbal abuse, right? So someone insulting you, someone yelling at you, someone accusing you, someone blaming you. And he's saying, well, you can contemplate that sound, that experience, that abuse is actually a dependently arisen experience, right? So we tend to think like, oh, they're abusing me. I'm hearing all this abuse. But he's saying, well, wait a minute, contemplate it, look at it, meditate on it, observe it, reflect on it through the lens of the Dhamma, not through the lens of our preferences and our biases, our habits. But when you apply the lens of the Dhamma, then you can reflect on it in a different way. And you can reflect that actually that sound you're experiencing, it's just a dependently arisen experience. It's not personal, right? It's like when the trees bloom, then it's not like, oh, I made the trees bloom, or the tree was wishing, may I bloom, and it controlled itself. It's just a process of nature. So the arising of sounds and the hearing of sounds is the process of nature, right? Our eyes grew without our controlling them. The sounds came without us asking for them. And when the sound waves met the ear, and when the mind was applying attention to that aspect of the body, the sound arose. If there were no ear, we wouldn't hear the sound. If the person never spoke, and the sound wave didn't make contact with the ear, we would have never heard the sound. If our mind was off somewhere else, the sound wouldn't have arisen at the ear base. So the idea here is that he's inviting the practitioner to contemplate that actually this is not personal. It's actually not that I'm hearing abuse. It's not the case that they're abusing me, but rather there's just a sound occurring, just a process of nature happening. And then he's saying that they can contemplate, okay, so this is dependent. This is just a temporary, dependent experience. It's not personal. It's not permanent. It's not to be lamented about. It's not to be fretting about. It's not to be emotionally involved in. It's just some kind of impersonal, dependent, temporary, conditional arising. And so then he says that then they can contemplate that all the aggregates that are risen there, right? Well, of course, the feeling, the perception, the volitional activity, and the consciousness, so the awareness of the sound, the physical sound in the ear itself, the perception of the sound. So, for example, perceiving the different words, right? How we interpret the sound, the feeling, like the unpleasant feeling of hearing the sound, and the movements of the mind, like thinking about the sound, reacting to the sound, getting angry about the sound. All of those things are temporarily arisen experiences. They arose and they'll pass away. And they didn't arise in and of themselves. They're not personal. They're not substantial. They're just temporary manifestations. It's kind of like when the leaves turn from green and they start to turn into brown. So it's not like when the leaf is green, it's just a temporary experience, but it will fade. Eventually it will change color, and eventually the leaf will wither. And so the leaf doesn't have like a permanent fixed state, right? Just when the conditions change, the leaf will change colors. So when particular conditions come together, you'll hear sounds and you'll have particular perceptions and feelings, but it's not actually personal. It's just a temporary shift of that experience. And so then if you contemplate, oh, that's impermanent, you contemplate that's dependent, that's not personal, then that can give you some distance, some space. Almost like, people will sometimes say, if a tree falls in an empty field, does it make a sound? So if a sound arises in an empty field, does anyone hear the sound? We only hear the sound if we put ourselves in there, if we get involved. But actually, if you contemplate it like that, it's empty. It's just a temporary, empty experience. Then it can help give you some space. And so what Sariputta is saying is that their mind having made it, that element is objective support, he's referring to that particular theme of Dhamma. So reflecting on that that kind of perception, that reflection, that recognition, you could say, of the impermanence and of the dependency. That it's anicca sankatang paticca samuppanna kaya dhammang vaya dhammang viraga dhammang nirodha dhamma. So it's impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen, of the nature to fade, to disappear, to vanish, and to cease. So you're supposed to be entering into that element, like that perception, that mode, that lens, and settle your mind at that level, rather than on the level of, I don't like this sound, they're saying this to me. But you change the lens and you enter into a new element, like a new perspective, a new basis of your mind. So you're actually perceiving the sound maybe, but your mind is not resting on that level. It's on a different level, which is the level of dependency and impermanence, impersonality. And so then he says they acquire confidence, steadiness, and resolution, meaning that their mind kind of enters into that. So their mind can become stabilized in that perception, just like, or in that reflection, in that contemplation, in that observation. And so that is the kind of element, quote unquote, that he's referring to. It's that new shift. Like at the same time, there is the sound, but at the same time, there's another element there. It's already there. It's always available, but you just have to find and stabilize your mind on that. So those are some thoughts that come up for this. And then maybe let's see, Venerable, if you have comments on this one here. Says, you found a beautiful sutta about joy and called Joy and Happiness. It's very short. May you request a sutta study on it out of compassion. Okay, and then it says that having aramo, delight or joy, in these 6 phenomena lays the groundwork for joy and happiness here and now. So delighting in the Dhamma, delighting in cultivation, delighting in abandoning, delighting in seclusion, delighting in non-ill will, and delighting in non-proliferation. And you're asking about, to speak briefly on these 6 and inspire us to cultivate them. Madam, what do you have?
Well, one way we can look at this is looking deeply into this particular Dhamma by way of what blocks the delight. Why do we not delight in the Dhamma? After the Buddha's awakening, it is said that he had a moment of determining whether to teach the Dhamma for fear that it would be difficult to grasp, difficult for beings to contemplate. And after seeing with the Dhamma eye, surveying the world and seeing that there are beings with little dust in their eyes who could indeed contemplate, could indeed get the meaning of the Dhamma, who could indeed delight. But before then, it said that it was seen clearly that the Buddha saw that there were many beings in the world, perhaps most, that delighted in attachment, that delighted in sensual pleasures, delighted in craving. So I would ask to contemplate why it is that we don't delight in the Dhamma. What blocks us from seeing this Dhamma as something to cultivate, as something to take as a treasure, something beautiful to keep, to watch over, to cultivate? Most of the time, if you look closely and carefully into the mind, you will see that it is this personality view, this idea that there's something happening for me, there's something happening against me, there's something that I want that I'm not able to get, or something that I don't want that's being forced upon me. And so we can very easily tie the sutta we Venerable just spoke about in terms of using the elements to steady the mind, in terms of the impersonality of the contact between the internal and external sense spheres, to get an idea of what it might be like to have a mind such that when sense impingement takes place, the Dhamma is the paradigm that the mind automatically flows into. And so when this happens, when you see the mind is able to steady itself, the mind is able to protect itself with the Dhamma. The mind is able to understand what's happening quickly, sharply, deeply, as it's happening. You'll find that a certain delight comes up in the mind automatically. The delight comes from the mind knowing that when the phenomena is impinging, when the yogas, when the floods are coming, that the mind has a place, it has a refuge, it has an island that it can resort to without without delay and without a doubt. So then this brings us to the next subject of delighting in the cultivation. Why would we delight? When we sense that the mind has a way now, unlike before, we understood the Dhamma, we practiced the Dhamma and studied the Dhamma. Now that the mind knows how to escape from suffering, the mind knows the way to the end of suffering, the cultivation becomes a glad experience in the mind. Once the mind attains faith, a gladness comes up because we now know how to put the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion out, abandoning, delighting in seclusion, delighting in non-proliferation. So I would ask a question by way of a simile. Let's say you are going about your daily life. Perhaps you're on your way to your job, or on your way to some normal activity, and you find that something happens unexpectedly. You are slammed into perhaps by another car, and out of the blue, you have no idea. You're completely disoriented as to where you are and what to do and how to apply the Dhamma. If you have cultivated an understanding, a right view, a way of understanding and applying the Dhamma into this particular situation, then it becomes easy to see in that moment that the contact that the one car made with the other is just a contact between two elements. But if at any point in the collision, a self is born, then you can see how the proliferation will start. Something is happening to me. But if no one is in the car, if no one is there, like the Arahatas, then the collision is just happening. The one element is touching another element. The trees falling in the woods, something is just touching. And the Arahants are considered the contactless ones. Why? Because they've gotten rid of this idea that there is a person. There is an inherently existing, enduring person to be aggravated or irritated. So by cultivating this understanding, by developing this understanding of not self, of the reality of the elements existing, and that the elements are not mine, they're not something that I created, they're not something that I can control. When I take a bite of food and swallow, I have no control over the digestive process. I have no control over the respiratory system, this blood circulation. These things are happening. I have no control over how this body was born, what size, what shape, what color, what happens to it. It's not mine to control. So as that understanding becomes deeper and deeper, as we cultivate that understanding, and not necessarily from a theoretical point of view, but when we practice it, in those moments when we're having a difficult time or something is not going as we wished, and we are able to call up this Dhamma, able to remember that what's happening now is just impermanence displaying itself. These are just laws of nature. playing out, then I have now a weapon, a sword of Dhamma that I can cut through, very deeply cut through the delusion that would agitate. And so in this way, we find that the cultivation of these practices come up naturally. It's not something we have to wish for, as in the Anguttara Nikaya, 11.2, describes the volition that's not really needed when we understand the natural way that the Dhamma is working through applying the principles of the Dhamma, one by one, step by step. So I want to know, Bhante, do you have anything to add to this?
I think that's great. Yeah. Is there any, maybe non-harming? But I think that's pretty good. I think that's good. I mean, maybe I would just riff off of the same theme that Venerable was just saying, because she didn't touch as much on non-harming and non-proliferation, that those would extend as well. Like, you delight in the Dhamma, you delight in cultivating those qualities, and then by extension, in abandoning the opposite of those qualities, and then you delight in seclusion. Delight in seclusion from what? Seclusion from the defiling, corrupting, burning, painful influences, defilements, unhealthy mind states, painful emotions, and qualities that arise when your mind is corrupted. And then similarly, you start to seclude yourself from those people who might influence you, who are going with the stream of the world towards unskillfulness, towards non-virtue, towards non-stillness. So you start to be secluded both physically and mentally, and then you delight in non-harming.
Last one.
Yeah, these two here.
Yeah. Non-proliferation. Have you ever had a moment where you in the past you might have seen the thinking mind becoming active? Maybe you might proliferate, or you might go on and on and on about something that happened. But at some point, something in the mind lets go. You realize, if I follow this, I'm going to suffer. If I take this up, if I touch it, even this much, I'm going to suffer. So by really getting it, by really understanding how dukkha arises from craving, from pushing and pulling a phenomenon, when the mind really understands it, or understands it enough, that cycle of letting go begins to happen, because it's natural. When you realize something is hot, nobody has to tell you to take your hand off the fire. So when you realize a phenomena that's coming up in the mind is actually burning the mind, it's actually harming the mind, it's actually dangerous to my peace and happiness, the mind starts to let go. And so then you might find yourself in situations where, maybe you're talking to someone, and perhaps they may have an argumentative bent. They like to, they have strong opinions, and they have lots of ideas. And something in you just like, I'm just not going to touch that. I'm not going to get involved. And the mind just lets it go. And you experience in that moment, maybe the first time it happens, you realize you actually can let go of defilements. It's a really wonderful thing when you realize the mind has enough strength to let defilements rise up, display themselves, big and bad, big and bold, and pass away. And when that understanding is grasped, even a tiny bit, it brings up a certain kind of confidence, a certain kind of steadiness. And so the mind that used to proliferate and, go on and on and on, and, maybe you turn what we call a molehill into a mountain, suddenly the mind becomes much, much quieter and is much more inclined to peace and finding harmonious ways to settle situations. And many times a harmonious path, speaking of non-harming, is just to just to withdraw, just to keep quiet, to just like keep the mind simple, keep the conversation simple. You find yourself using fewer words, maybe, or words that go to the heart, that touch the point, that don't necessarily elaborate, because the Buddha describing that nothing, he couldn't find a simile for how fast the mind changes. So if you find that you're, getting, you let the mind proliferate, if you start talking and you keep the conversation going beyond what is necessary, beyond what is essential, it's easy to see how a conversation can start wholesome, kusala, and then it doesn't take long for the mind to turn to akusala, for the same conversation, for the track to bend in the direction of akusala. So we need a lot of mindfulness. And it has to be quick. It has to be sharp. It has to be constant. So the non-proliferation, again, it's another layer, kind of like a protection, but not something that's necessarily being willed. It's like a happening. When the understanding is there of the danger, when the mind understands the danger, the abandoning is happening. When the abandoning is happening, the seclusion is happening. When the seclusion is happening, the non-harming is happening, because I'm not all up in it in the same way that I might have been before. And the non-proliferation becomes sort of like an automatic result of just relaxing and staying with the Dhamma that we've already metabolized. Mm-hmm.
And then Anna is asking about recent talks given on the subject of emptiness, of sunyata, specifically the meditations on emptiness that the Buddha talks about. And I'm glad that you enjoyed those, Anna. Really happy to hear people listening in, reflecting, and finding that useful. And there's one repeated line you say, as to what remains, they understand that it is present. Can you please clarify? So I apologize for all those who will hear me repeating this, because I've said it many, many times. But of course, actually in Buddhism, repetition is good. We like to repeat because then it can sink in. And the Venerable was just mentioning, actually, sometimes we don't need to elaborate, but we just need to let something sink in deeper, right? So I'll just repeat myself and ask for forgiveness. And so, as I mentioned in the talks, and as I mentioned here in person, what is the Buddha talking about when he's talking about emptiness in that sutta, in the Chula Sunyata Sutta? So imagine that it's storming, that there's loud rain, loud thunder, lightning crashing through the sky, wind whipping the trees around, and it's so loud. And then the storm comes to a close, and you find, it's so peaceful. It's so quiet. But actually, most of the time, it's like that. So what is different? You're not perceiving the sound that's usually there. It's the exact same sound, but you're perceiving the absence of the disturbance. You're perceiving the lack of the storm, the absence of the wind, the absence of the rain, the absence of the thunder, the absence of the chaos, and it makes it so peaceful. Or when you've been very sick, you've had a fever, you've had a headache, you've had a throat ache, an earache, an eye ache, right, a stomach ache, and then it goes away, and you feel so healthy, so strong. But actually, most of the time, you might not be sick. What's the difference? It's not that you're focusing on the sensations of the body. Those are maybe always like that. You're focusing on the absence of sickness, the lack of disturbance, the emptiness of something. It's empty of what came before. It's empty of sickness. It's empty of storm. Or when there's been a lot of conversation, the conversation dies down, and you notice the normal, natural, habitual sounds but it sounds very quiet because you're perceiving something being gone. You're not perceiving something being present. So our mind is used to fixating on what's present. And as I've said many times again, that I can ask people, please start looking around. Please describe what is in this room. What is in the room where you're staying, right? There are chairs, there are cushions, there are people. But we don't tend to notice that there's space filling this room. There is space in most of the room because we're used to focusing on what is present, but not in the fact that actually there's a lot that's not present, right? And as I have said, if we started to count all the things that aren't in this room, it would be very crowded in here. There's no elephants, there's no circuses, there's no clowns, there's no giraffes, there are no large crowds of people, there's no large groups of tourists from China. It's a very, very crowded room if we started to count all the people that aren't in here, all the animals that aren't here. This library would be a lot fuller if we counted all the books that weren't here. Because the absence of something, though, is not the same as the presence of something. If you walk into a library and you say, oh, may I have a book? I'm looking for a book about Buddhism. And they say, oh, I'm sorry. There are no books about Buddhism here. And you say, oh, okay, so there are no books about Buddhism. So then I would like one no book about Buddhism, please. Right? If you say, oh, there are books about Buddhism, or there are no books about Buddhism, it's still saying there is something there. But one is an absence. So I can't hand you, here's 3 no books on Buddhism. I can hand you 3 books on Buddhism, right? So the absence of something is different from the presence of something. But it is a thing. You can focus on that, right? I can focus, oh, there are no books about Buddhism in this library. I can focus, wow, there's no storm going on. I can focus, wow, I'm not sick. I can focus, wow, there's space in here. What is not here? That you can focus on that. You can apply your mind to the absence of something, but it's not the same as applying your mind to the presence of something. So the Buddha is inviting us, shifting our attention to focus on what's absent, right? And in the sutta, he says, he tells Ananda, look around you. This hall that we're sitting in, it's empty. It's absent, lacking. Elephants, the busyness of the town, right? So in modern terms, it's lacking the semis, it's lacking the cars. And so it's lacking many things, and there's a lot of peace there. You might have been thinking, oh, it's so crowded in here. But then you think about, oh, but it's so calm compared to New York City. It's so calm compared to the town. So when you perceive the absence, your mind can become calm. You can establish your meditation not on an object that's present, but on the absence of something. And now you're meditating on emptiness. But then the Buddha says, so this room is absent, it's empty, it's lacking the disturbances of the town. But as to what is present, there is still that oneness there which remains, namely the hall. So maybe you say, oh, it's so peaceful after the storm. It's empty of storm, and you can focus on that. But then you can shift your attention and say, okay, it's empty of the storm, but it's still full of whatever is there. It's still full of maybe the sounds of the birds chirping. So then you notice, oh, a disturbance is gone. And when you focus on the absence of disturbance, it's very peaceful. But then when you reapply your mind to what is present, now you can contrast. And you find that something being present is still disturbing. So then you try to empty your mind of that, and you try to perceive a more natural absence, right? So then, for example, when we did the meditation, you can then perceive that, oh, this room is very empty of many things, find a lot of peace in that. But then notice, but it's also full of many things, and that's disturbing. So then you notice, but whether or not it's full of things, the space of this room remains unchanged. The space remains unaffected. You let your mind rest, settle into a more natural state, which observes the space that objects take up. It observes the lack of objects, which is a necessary condition to have things in the room, right? You need to have the space. Whether you move objects around, the space remains there. So you let your mind rest on that more natural perception of space, and then but you perceive it in such a way that you're focusing on the space is empty of all the objects. And you find, oh, that's so peaceful. It's empty of the disturbance of the busyness. It's empty of the disturbance of the objects. But then you shift your mind. Because the point is that if we tend to focus just on emptiness, it's relative emptiness. It's not absolute emptiness. It's not pure emptiness. There are still things present. So the Buddha wants you to shift your attention this way. Find that emptiness is more peaceful than presence. But don't settle for that emptiness. Then you shift. But what is still present? Right? What have I not let go of yet? So for example, then he says, well, the space is occurring within, the mind is aware of the space. There's the mind which is aware. So then you focus on the awareness. Any awareness of space that occurs within awareness. And then he continues on. And so you're emptying out the mind by focusing on something more natural, which is more empty, which is less disturbing. And he uses this word dadatta. Dadatta means like a stress, means a disturbance. It means maybe a nuisance. It means something which is coarse, right? It's a synonym of dukkha. It's a synonym of something that's kind of painful, that's kind of imperfect, that's difficult. And so he's saying, when you focus on emptiness, you're focusing on the absence of some particular dadatta, the absence of some disturbance. But when you reapply your mind to that very same emptiness, you'll notice that it's still relative. There's still something present. And it's that shift of attention, that shift from emptiness to what is the oneness present, what is that unity of something there, what is the presence, that shift is what teaches you that you haven't reached the perfect emptiness yet, because there's still some disturbance there. But if that's the only thing we know, if the most quiet thing you've ever experienced is a very busy mind, you don't know what real quiet is. So you might think that's the best it can get. So you have to notice, oh, maybe it's very quiet in the room, but the mind is very noisy. So then you're shifting. You found peace through the emptiness of noise, but you notice the disturbance of the loud mind. And so then you try to move to the next stage. But then you might think, oh, so that's it then. But the Buddha says, no. What is still present there? So it's that shift. It's that switching back and forth between emptiness and fullness, So that's what it means by, as to what remains, they understand that it is present. So not being deluded about thinking that some level of peace, some level of emptiness, that's the end goal, that's the end point, that you've reached the best, but actually noticing, no, there is still something there. Because you're focusing on what's absent, but you're not yet focusing on what is still present. So it's just that balance, that shifting back and forth, which is what's kind of guiding the meditation in the Chula Samyutta Sutta. That's why the Buddha is guiding this mix between peace and between tranquility, peace, and insight or understanding. Because he's having you develop peace, but then understanding that peace is still relative. And then based off that understanding, you develop more peace. And so he's kind of balancing those two qualities. And that understanding, but as to what remains, that's where you shift away from the peace of emptiness and you start to shift into what is the next stage.
I heard a simile that will make this point, hopefully will make this point really clear. So imagine that your only experience in your life is equivalent to having 10,000 blenders going. That's all you know. And so you go on retreat and suddenly you experience your mind going from being agitated by 10,000 blenders to 2,000 blenders. And you think this is like really, really peaceful. And then someone, maybe one of the teachers explains, well, you actually, it can become more peaceful than that. But relative to 10,000 blenders, 2,000 blenders is really, really peaceful. Right? So then you get your mind over the course of the retreat to go from 2,000 blenders to 500 blenders to 400 blenders to 100 blenders. And you think, oh my God, I've never had such a peaceful mind in my life. 100 blenders is just like incredible. But there's still 100 blenders there. Right? If relative to 10,000, it's really quiet, but there's still 100 blenders. It's only when you realize that 100 blenders compared to no blenders, which is possible, you're clinging to 100 blenders, that you can work your mind slowly from 500 blenders to 50 blenders to 20 blenders. Maybe you can't go overnight, but slowly, you have to really see and be willing to let go of. And this teaching helps us to shift slowly from understanding that the refrigerator hum that you become accustomed to, you didn't really know it was there until it went off. But as soon as the refrigerator hum goes off, it's like, oh, Now it's quiet. But relative to that hum, you know, you can sense that there is something more peaceful than that. Does that make sense? I'll give you one more. A story I heard told, but this is from the simile I just gave you was from Temple Smith. But a story that's in the suttas is when Venerable Anuruddha was a child. He was said to be a prince, and maybe by present day we could describe him as a spoiled kid. So he was playing with his friends, and apparently he was betting something, and he had to pay with cakes. So he sent a message, one of his servants, home to his mother to ask for cakes. And the mother sent a message back that we don't have any cakes. There are no cakes. But he didn't understand no cake, because on the way back with the empty plate, he couldn't get it. So his mother sent an empty plate to show him that there are no cakes. So a deity, it said, put a delicious cake into the plate. So he got the cake, and in his mind, it was a no cake, because the no cake turned into something. So what we're doing, whether we know it or not, what we're doing is we're taking the idea of nothing and wanting something. And even if someone told us there's nothing, what we're after, the goal, is the absence of greed, the absence of things. That's really peaceful. The absence of feeling, the absence of contact, the absence of perception, the absence of volitional formations and consciousness. That's true peace. The cessation of all formations. We don't understand cessation. We don't understand absence. And so by wanting to make absence into something, the mind continues to grab.
Yeah, there's a similar story. We can just keep going about this, but I'll say one. There's a similar story apparently from Alice in Wonderland, where someone's coming and they say, "Oh," they say, "Is anyone coming?" This is my course memory, so maybe it's a retelling. But they say, "Oh, they're looking down the road," and I think it's maybe some kind of queen or something, and Alice says, "Oh, nobody's coming," and she says, "Wow, you can see nobody from this far away," right? So it's not a person coming, right? Nobody's not a person. Exactly like the no cakes is not a cake, So that's exactly it. And I hope you're doing well, Mike. Wishing you well. Okay, and so then Suraj is asking about the world being made from a duality, light and dark. It has mutual conditions as a base, anyamanya pattaya. But what is the origin, samudaya, of the subha dhatu? Okay, well, I'm not sure if I understand your question, so maybe Venerable can have comment, but I'll make something very brief, is that...
Maybe she's talking about the Chula Veda or something? Where the Dhammadina and what we're talking about the opposite of dukkha is sukha, the opposite of sukha is dukkha.
It could be. I was going to mention another sutta, but maybe you want to talk about that one. Mm-hmm. The one I was going to mention, there is a sutta where the Buddha says, what is the, how he talks about the element of light comes from the element of dark. And the element of the beautiful, the subha, comes from the element of the asubha, the non-beautiful. So very similar to, lightness only makes sense in the context of dark. Dark only makes sense in the context of light. And so I'm not sure exactly what you're asking now. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts on this, Venerable, that you would like to reflect on?
What is the origin of subha dhatu? I'm not really sure what you're getting at by asking what the origin of subha dhatu is, because it sounds like what your question is getting, and again, I can't be sure, but if you're asking about duality, like what's that about? Like, why is the world, um, uh, why is there a sort of a pairwise progression of dualities in the world? Like, how do we understand it? How do we work with it? And most importantly, how do we come out of it? One simile that's actually been really helpful is years ago I heard a talk where it was the idea of the universe being in sort of a perfect balance, being at perfect zero. Maybe it was a physicist who was just describing how everything in the universe is at zero. There are no like accidents, so to speak. There's a reason for things to happen, and so because we're on this side of the universe, or this side of the planet, we see things like right now. It's like I don't know, going up 8:15 here, so it's dark. But on the opposite side of the planet, it's light, right? It's daytime. But there's not like an inherent difference between like that phenomenon, like the sunrise and the sunset are not two things. We can't see the sunrise from this vantage point, but the sunrise and the sunset are just sort of two aspects of the same phenomenon. It's the same thing. So when you're grasping, when you're craving something or when you're wanting something, suffering is the conjoined twin. They go together. You buy one, as Bhante G says, you get one free. They're dependently arising. They're related conditions. So when we see things in terms of opposites, it's because the mind is clinging to the perception of a duality through the vipalasas, the perception of something being permanent when in fact it's impermanent, the perception of something being beautiful when in fact it's not beautiful, the perception of something being happiness when in fact it's dukkha, it's suffering, and the perception of something being me and mine and myself when the fact is it's not myself. So we're seeing things in terms of a duality. We're seeing things in terms of a me, of a subject and an object, because the subject and the object are co-arising. To whatever extent I'm invested in objects, I'm attached to objects, then the self is being produced by that same grasping attempt. And so how we're looking determines what we see. How we're engaging is determining how we're experiencing. So when we're able to sort of train the mind to shift that paradigm from being deluded by the permanence, the pleasure, the me, mine, and mineness of objects, the sense of a duality, the sense of a me here and a you there, and something being created for me or against me, that starts to fade. Can I add anything?
I think that's good. Yeah. And then Mike's asking, independent origination, does name and form not only refer to body and mind, but also the interconnection of body and mind? And then maybe we just add on this. Are there any suttas or practices that can aid in seeing that body comes from mind? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that although we can translate name and form, the Pali word being nam rupam, as body and mind. That's actually quite an imperfect translation, as all translation is. One reason being that when we say body mind, in terms of our Western conditioning, which would include basically anyone who speaks English, not just because if you learn English, you're learning a Western language, and so the kind of Western, the English nature of the word body, the phrase body and mind, we take that to mean like basically everything. Your mind and your body, and it's like, oh, okay, those are two things, and they are somehow related or equal or whatever the theory that one might have about them is, but it's like a complete picture. But Namarupang in Buddhism is the Buddha contrasts. He doesn't contrast the body and the mind. So that's not a Buddhist. Really, in the suttas, that's not how the Buddha does it. He doesn't have a body-mind duality. He contrasts vijnana to namarupam. He contrasts consciousness to name and form. So often when people say mind, they might be thinking especially of like consciousness. And it's like, how does consciousness relate to the body? Well, for the Buddha, consciousness and the body are not a duality. It's rather the consciousness paired with certain mental functions in the body. So they kind of go together. And so, for example, I'll give just one example of this is imagine something like color. So imagine that you see a red flower. And so you think, okay, there's the physical flower, it has physical features. Like, for example, the scent of the flower, maybe the color of the flower, it's red, the texture of the flower. Okay, well, color is something which doesn't exist independently in the flower, right? That is something that all scientists would agree with. The flower isn't red.
It's everything but red.
Yeah. Heck, yeah. If anything, it's not, it's anything but that. Yeah. So, but like if you take a bee and look at it, the bee might see a different color. You take a dog, they might see a different color. As I mentioned before, I'm colorblind. So I will perceive it differently. I'm red-green colorblind. So I'll perceive it differently from even another human being. So the color is not in the flower. So you think, oh, the flower is the physical part, and then there's the mind observing it. Well, the red is actually part of the mental experience. So is the smell, right? Smell is not an objective thing. Smell is created through nerve endings in your nose, for example, and many other factors like perception. So people with different associations, different memories, different experiences, they'll experience different types of smells because their mind will relate, construct, break down, label, organize, differentiate, and kind of construct smells in different ways. So it's not like the smell is just objectively, that's the smell of the flower, period. No, there is a smell it's mixed with the mentality of the person. And similarly with the color, similarly with the texture, right? So the physical part of the flower and the mental parts of the flower, they're really not separable. You can't actually separate them, right? It's just, if you take away all of the mental experiences, all the mental parts of the flower, like things like color and the perception of the flower, the feeling, the sensation of the flower, the way that your mind is attending to the flower, which gives you different angles on it, right? Remember that old, not so old, but that's maybe a few years ago, 5-10 years ago, there was this famous social media thing with the blue dress and the white dress, right? And some people saw a blue and black dress, and some people saw a white and gold dress, and it was the same picture. And so which color is it, right? So the way that the mind attends was affecting that. Similarly, the intentions, the thoughts, the associations, and so on. So the experience of the flower, if you were to take all that away, there would be no flower. You wouldn't be taught, there would be no flower. Nothing to see, nothing to smell, nothing to taste, nothing to touch, nothing to pay attention to. So where is this flower? So if you take away the mentality, then the physicality of the flower is just, it's incomprehensible. But at the same time, if you take away the physicality, then there is nothing differentiating a flower from the next thing. The physicality aspect to it, the shape to it, and also the color, they're interrelated. It's not just mental. It's not just physical. It's not some kind of, it's kind of like an interplay, yeah. And then the Buddha contrasts, or he doesn't contrast that, but he relates that to what he calls vijnana, or consciousness, which is basically just the presence of that phenomena, the awareness of that thing, right? Because in order you have the different kind of, one way of thinking about it might be, imagine a screen, and you have the images on the screen. So the screen is closer to like consciousness, right? But the images on the screen are not. We could say that the images on the screen and the screen are also not really separable, because even if nothing's being projected on the screen, there is still the light. Like you'll see the white screen, so that's the image on the screen. So there is no screen if there's not an image coming off of it. So the screen is like the basis for the presence of something, but the basis doesn't exist independently, because it is simply like the reflection of that thing. So the Buddha relates consciousness to name and form. So that's why it's kind of I know a little bit long-winded and it might be a little bit complicated, but it is pretty important, because if you start to think about it as like, oh, the mind and the body, then you kind of divide experience in a different way from how the Buddha was doing it. And so yes, the dependent origination, Namarupa is about, as you mentioned here, the interconnection of body and mind, as we've just been discussing. So it is about how the mental parts and the physical parts of a being and of life, how they interrelate, and how they also relate to consciousness, how they relate to awareness. And one other example I'll give of this is that imagine that you have for example, in the Mahanidana Sutta, Digha Nikaya number 15. So one of the longest suttas about dependent origination in the Pali Canon. And the Buddha says there to his attendant Ananda, he says, Ananda, Namarupa Patya Vijnana, Vijnana Patya Namarupa. So consciousness is dependent on name and form name and form is dependent on consciousness, which in another sutta, a disciple of the Buddha likens this to two sheaves of reeds. Yeah, exactly, leaning on one another. And so these two sheaves of reeds leaning on each other, if one falls, the other falls, right? So they are mutually dependent. And so in this sutta, in the Mahanidana Sutta, the Buddha tells his attendant Ananda, he says, Ananda, how are you to understand Vijnana Patya Namarupam, that name and form is dependent on consciousness? He says, well, if consciousness were to descend into the womb, the mother's womb, if it were not to do that, would name and form take shape there? No. And so what does that, simple terms, what does that mean? The baby, if the baby is dead, it's not going to develop into a human being. It's just a lump of dead flesh. And so then similarly, if the consciousness were to depart from the womb, would it continue to grow up and mature? No, right? So it would be like a stillbirth. So it wouldn't be a child, like a living child. And similarly, once the child is born, if they are basically to die, young, are they going to grow up and become an adult? No. So what's the difference between someone who's alive and someone who's dead? It's the ability to be conscious. So what's the difference between someone who's in a coma and someone who's dead? Person in a coma, we say, well, consciousness could re-arise there. Someone who's dead, it's like consciousness will not re-arise. So the presence, the ability of consciousness to function in a body, that's what we mean by someone being alive. And so the Buddha is saying, that, but if you just have a lump of flesh, like if we just take this, consciousness doesn't arise here. Because, as this is the basis, because this doesn't have any mental capabilities. It doesn't have the ability to perceive. It doesn't have the ability to feel sensations. So the physical body has some of those abilities, but also there are mental functions, mental capacities, which have to be present in order for consciousness to function. You can't have a conscious rock because it doesn't have the ability to have sensations and perceptions. So consciousness, and it requires a physical body, but it also requires mental capacities, mental functions, and they have to kind of go together. And similarly, if consciousness is not present, then there is no such thing as a living body. The physical body is not a body anymore. It's just a bunch of dirt. And it doesn't have any mental experiences, because in order to have mental capacities, consciousness needs to be present. So these two relate to one another, right? So that's one example of how the Buddha talks about the relationship between the body and the mind, and consciousness and name and form, and so on. Venerable, did you want to offer more reflections?
Just one other thing, that maybe what this person is getting to is the Buddha did describe with the deity that there's I posed the question to the Buddha, there's a tangle within and a tangle without. Who can untangle this tangle? And so there's a way in which the Buddha described the relationship between name and form as one interplay, and the relationship between name and form and consciousness is another interplay. So there's an interplay of name and form, which is the tangle within, and the relationship between name and form and consciousness as the tangle without. So by understanding that these two are working together, they cannot be separated, but also the name and form can't be separated from consciousness. So they're relating to each other as one sheath of reed, and their consciousness is relating to them as the other one, holding each other up. And by seeing them in that way, by understanding that these are not inseparable phenomena, you cannot have a plate of food if you look at the phenomena as it is. You can, next time you have a meal, you can look at your plate and you can ask yourself a really simple question. Okay, you said you look at your plate. You can say, okay, is the food in the color? No. Is the color the food? The color of the food, is the color of the food the food? No. Is the smell of the food, the smell itself, is the smell of the food? No. Is the taste, the separate from everything else, the sense sphere of taste, is the taste the food? No. So when you go through the 6 sense bases, and when you go through the 5 aggregates and you look for the food itself, it can't be found. So it's really rupa sanya. It's really the perception of form that we're really grasping. We're looking at something and making it a thing because we're perceiving it through nama, through pasa or contact, feeling, perception, intention, and attention. That's the constituents of nama. And the rupa, of course, is just the patwi, apo, teja, wa, the 4 primary elements. So when we see it as it is, you can't find the thingness of the thing. Without the mind getting involved with the form and naming it, giving it a label, there is no thing there. And without the form being labeled a bowl, there's no mind, there's no conscious, there's no nama. So these things are just like ghosts, just like ghosts interplaying with each other. And so that's how we can untangle it.
Yeah. I think on that point, maybe on the image of the sheaves of reeds, right? It's like the 2 sheaves are leaning against each other, right? But the sheaves also have many different parts to them. So it's like the many types of consciousness and the parts of name and form. So it's like what you're pointing to there, the intertangle, right? Okay, and greetings to Mariah. And then we have a question here. It says that they have only more recently been drawn to Buddhism and the teachings over the past 5 years. And even though you listen to Dhamma talks and read scripture, in a weird way, you don't feel confident calling yourself a Buddhist when someone asks you about your faith. Any advice or any ways to formally become a Buddhist?
Don't become a Buddhist. Becoming is the layup for birth. Birth is the layup for death, suffering, lamentation, sorrow, and grief and despair. But I think I know what you mean by becoming a Buddhist. But if you want to free yourself from suffering, you don't have to necessarily become a Buddhist. I don't think the Buddha was a Buddhist. But what you're pointing to, I think, is your willingness or your interest in understanding the teachings of the Buddha. So by framing it in the way of really wanting to grow in wisdom, you can, someone asked a question the other night when I did a class off-site about Buddhism. And I had a hard time answering the question from a theoretical, theological, scholastic point of view, because I think what people are really interested in when they're asking these kinds of questions, becoming a Buddhist, or I think what really people are wanting to know is, how can I be happy? How can I get out of this suffering? Maybe you've been searching, you've been listening to Dhamma talks, you've been reading scriptures, and these are very good things, because wisdom can develop through listening to the Dhamma, studying the Dhamma. And realization can happen through the growth of wisdom. So this is very good. So it is encouraged, and it is to be encouraged to continue to listen, to continue to read, to continue to search, to continue to study. But faith, when we look at the Paticcasamuppada, we understand from the Buddhist teachings that in that the principle of conditioned arising, or dependent arising, is one thing, but the illustration of that principle are those factors. The arising of sankharas from avijja, avijja pachaya sankhara, sankhara pachaya vinyanam, etc., all the way to eva metasa, the kevalasa, dukkha dukhandasa, samudaya hoti, the arising of this entire mass of suffering. But in the reverse order, we find something really strange, something really wonderful, actually, which is the cessation of suffering that begins with suffering. It is by suffering, it is by understanding that there is suffering happening here, that a person can go into two directions. You can move in the direction of confusion and muddle-mindedness, or you can move in the direction of search for a way out. And that search, it's that very search from the suffering that leads to faith. Okay? So you said someone asked you about your faith, how to become a Buddhist. It sounds like what you're asking is, how can I grow in faith? How can I develop my faith in the Buddhist teachings? So I would just point you to your suffering. And when you're suffering, make good use of it. Make good use of the suffering. Don't waste the suffering by trying to push it away, by trying to outrun it, by trying to dodge it. But remember, the instruction of the Buddha is that suffering has to be understood. It has to be understood. Squarely, it has to be understood. It has to be met. And when we meet the suffering, sincerely, honestly, when we meet it, when we have a willingness to take it on, to look deeply into what is happening here? Why am I agitated? What's bothering me? What's the problem? Then we can start to see, I'm wanting something that's not here, that's not available to me. Or I'm not wanting something that I have no control over. And when we see that suffering, and we see it clearly for ourselves, and we develop a willingness to meet it, to understand it, to stop trying to bypass it, then we develop naturally, because we're not muddle-minded anymore. We're not running away anymore. We're not using our same old habitual habits to try to get rid of it anymore. That willingness to meet suffering naturally moves in the direction of faith, and it gives rise to gladness, and on and on and on until there's knowledge and realization of deliverance, knowledge and realization of freedom. That's the reverse end. But I think this is a point that's very easily missed in the West. For us Western practitioners, we're in a very comfortable situation with our luxurious, affluent society. We can have hot water at the turn of the tap. We go to the grocery store. The aisles are full, chock full of everything we can imagine. It's a flick of a button, Amazon. There's basically nothing we can't access very quickly. So we can very easily dull ourselves and cut ourselves off, anesthetize ourselves from the truth of suffering, because we have so many ways to escape from it, or to temporarily suppress it. put it aside. But Buddhism, the message of the Buddha, is that there is a way out, and it doesn't need to involve turning to sense pleasures, because that's not the way out. The way out is, in fact, the way in.
And Bhumika's saying the ceremony was good on the bows. Really happy to hear that people were following along with that, because I didn't know if maybe it was going to be useful. So I heard some people followed along. So very happy it was beneficial. And Gregory says, "Hiya Satima, how long do you plan to be at Empty Cloud? And for those who might want to visit."
We'll see.
Okay. So we have more deep questions. Mike says, "Does form is emptiness, emptiness is form, mean that form is only perceived by seeing what is not form? That form loses its meaning if all is form? And what all other things are defined the same way? Oh, and that all other things are defined the same way."
Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And the form is only perceived by seeing what is not form. Do you understand what that means?
I think so, Mike, you're pointing to the fact that, our mind needs to perceive diversity in order to perceive individuality, right? Like if everything was exactly the same, then there actually wouldn't be the perception of that distinct thing, because the perception of a distinct thing requires it be contrasted to other things. So the fact that, for example, you perceive like, oh, there's a person there, oh, there's a form there, there's an object there, that requires you to contrast it to what's not that thing. Otherwise, you couldn't actually perceive it. So in order to perceive something positive, it's true, we have to actually contrast it to the negative, right? So otherwise, what's the difference between red and yellow? How can you perceive red as distinct from yellow? Because your mind distinguishes them, and it's red as not yellow, just as a basic example, right, with color. So in order to perceive anything, in order to perceive anything, any single thing, any individual thing, it has to be contrasted to other things, the not of that thing, right? And so, yeah, that's true. And is that what form is emptiness, emptiness is form means? That is maybe another question, and I don't know if I would say that that's exactly what it means, but you could say it's related, because really what's more what form is emptiness, emptiness is form is kind of pointing to is that when we talk about form being empty, then it actually means that emptiness, the emptiness of something, is precisely that.
That's its nature.
The emptiness of something, the nature. So it's like if I say, oh, you're very tall. So tall is not some separate thing. Like it's referring to you being tall. So it's not like two things, right? It's one thing being described from the particular angle of tall. But then if I say, oh, so I'm very tall, so what does tall look like? Like it doesn't look like something separate. So form is empty means that form, it has the characteristic of being empty, of not having intrinsic existence, of not having independent existence, of not being substantial, of not being a substance, of not being inherently present, of not having a permanent core, of not having an internal essence. So different ways to try to say the same thing. But then some people will think they think that emptiness is some dimension. It kind of goes back to what Venerable was saying before of the story of the no cakes. Like, oh, there's no cakes. So, oh, I'd love to try some of those no cakes. Or it's like, oh, nobody's coming. Oh, I'd love to meet them. And it's like, you're not going to meet anybody if there's no cakes to try. And they say, oh, no cakes to try?
I'd like to
How
have
many?
some of
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
How many can I get?
Yeah. So, and like similarly, the one I told before, which I've heard from someone, is you go into the bakery and you say there's no croissants. They say, oh, there's no croissants. Say, oh, can I try 3 of those then? 3 no croissants. It's like there are none. Oh, none. What are those like then?
I
Right.
like
So
some.
yeah, yeah,
I like none.
yeah. So emptiness is form means like emptiness is not some separate thing. It's referring to the nature of that thing. So I believe that Venerable has a demonstration that she's going to do. So now we're going to, yeah.
All right. Here's a demonstration. Okay, this is, let's say, this is short. Somebody says, this is short. This, it's a fact. And then I hold this up. So now is it short? Where did short go? Can you see? Is it short in relation to this object? No, it's not inherently short. It's just short in relation to this. So now this one is, let's say this one is, or this we'll say small. This is small compared to this. This is right. So now, look carefully. I'm going to put. We've established that this is big. But now, where did the bigness go? Is it inherently in this object? Or is it just in relation to other objects? When you understand that it's not an inherently existing thing, it's just a relationship that's happening everywhere, all the time.
And then Dempson says, if possible, would you please name your favorite text within the Khuddaka Nikaya?
Book or text?
Maybe,
like the
maybe
Dhammapada?
anyone, yeah, maybe whatever you feel inspired to.
Dhammapada.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would say like Udana Dhammapada iti Vuttaka Tiragata Tirigata Suttanipata. So it's hard to say because there's all the books, yeah. But maybe my favorite, maybe if I had to single it out, just to be that personally, my favorite, I think my favorite text in the Khuddaka Nikaya is the Parayana Vagga, the chapter on the way to the beyond. So I memorized the questions, and I've done different Dhamma talks on those here before. So you can find those on the channel if you're interested. So that's one of my favorite. It's really deep, and it's one of those texts that it's an encounter. So many suttas in the tradition, they're organized, they're separate. Like there's the Mula Pariyaya Sutta. So the first sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. It's almost like they call it like a slice of life. So they're just different slices from the Buddha's life or the disciples' teachings. There's not necessarily like a thematic development. The characters are present, but they're relatively limited. And so that has a good advantage, right? Because then it's not there's not too many bells and whistles. But the Parayana Vagga, it has that mixture of it's very punchy. It's straight to the point. But it has a progression of 16 Brahmins coming to the Buddha, asking spiritual questions, but their urgency is palpable in the text, right? Because they're just they just want to know the way to be free of suffering. Yeah. They just want to know, how do we escape the cycle of samsara? How do we become free of suffering? What is the nature of, what's happening? And that urgency, that attention, and the clarity and the exchange that goes on between the Buddha and the Brahmins and the progression of the questions, it's really palpable. It's very powerful. And there's so much in those little things, those little poems that you can reflect on. Like the very first one, I won't do this for very long, so don't worry. The very first one, right? Ajita, he asked the Buddha, Kenasu nivato loko, kenasu napakasati, Kisa bhilepanang brosi kingsu tassa mahabhayam. Avidyaya nibuto loko. Pamada napakasati. Japa bhilepanang brumi dukhamasa mahabhayam. By what is the world shrouded? What is it wrapped in? What is it covered over by? And the Buddha says, it's shrouded in ignorance. Why does it not shine? It doesn't shine because of negligence. What is its sticky trap? What is it stuck in? It's stuck in prayer, stuck in hoping. What is its greatest fear? Its greatest fear is suffering. And like, you can just reflect on that. Those images, those responses, those qualities in your life. And then it even goes further. Later on, the Buddha says that the hindrance, the nivarana, which is the same word in the first line, he uses that in a positive sense for how to block the stream. So the poetry in there, the wordplay in there, and the images are very, very palpable. Like they're very deep, but very simple and short. So that's probably my favorite collection. I really recommend that you read it and that you study it and reflect on it.
What is the collection again?
Called The Way to the Beyond, or the chapter on the far shore, going to the far shore.
And where is that?
It's in the book called the Sutta Nipata. So I can show it to you after the live stream on the shelf. Yeah. Okay. And then Ansanta is asking if you have a sutta reference about the internal and external interplay, Venerable? From the tangle you were talking about?
Isn't that in the...
Sutta Nikaya?
Okay. You know the number.
I don't know if I know the number. It's in the ones. If you look at maybe Sutta Nikaya chapter 1, maybe like 23. I don't know. It's kind of a random guess.
I found a number for you.
Okay. So maybe while you're looking for that, I'll go to the next. And Asanta's, praising he sounded really thanking for the don't become a Buddhist teaching. And I don't think I've ever heard that before. Yeah, great. Yeah, I remember there was an interaction with one monk, and there was a bunch of monks visiting, and we were talking about, the classic question, like how did you found it?
7.6. Jata.
Okay, yeah.
Jata Sutta.
Sutta Nikaya 7.6.
Yep.
And yeah, so the monks we were talking about, like, oh, how did we become Buddhist? And the different monks were talking, and then one of the people there was like, I don't know if I am a Buddhist. And everyone was kind of like, oh. So anyway. Okay. And Mike says, could we also direct our meditation towards perceiving the emptiness of suffering? I hope you can, Mike. I would wish that upon you. But in the sutta, yes, the Buddha does teach eventually how to do that, right? That's kind of the whole point, right? Is to how can you direct your mind to perceive the emptiness of suffering? That would be if you did that, you'd have an awakening experience.
Or certainly you'd have the beginning to one.
Yeah.
If you look at the Majjhima Nikaya 152, Indriya Bhavana Sutta, the Buddha describes a way that you can train the mind to see the interaction, the impingement of forms with the eye, sounds with the ear, smells with the nose, etc., as coarse, conditioned, and dependently arisen. And he gives 6 similes in that sutta. That's Indriya Bhavana Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 152, where he describes 6 similes where when you develop the mind to see the dependent or arising nature of the phenomena as it's happening, the mind lets go. And then it becomes established immediately in equanimity. And whatever was agitating the mind, it's immediately cut off, and the mind becomes established once again in equanimity. So in other words, when you see something, you know that it becomes a meditation where you remind yourself, okay, this is coarse. This is a conditioned phenomena. It's happening. It's not inherently enduring. It's not inherently existing. It's arising from causes. It is subject to fade. It's subject to cease. And the mind lets go. And you do that with all the 6 sense spheres. and the mind is over and over and over and over. You repeat this whenever you contact something. You hang on to this tool. The mind establishes itself in equanimity. Buddha describes this as the way to enter upon the right way.
Yeah, maybe just building on that same point to tie it into the emptiness sutta is that very similarly, the Buddha talks about how through emptiness practice, someone can, by practicing rightly, enter into what he calls animitta ceto samadhi, where basically you could maybe take what Venerable is talking about, but if you developed it into like a stillness practice and you establish the mind in that kind of equanimity and you relinquish the perception of the distinction of forms, the distinction of sounds, so your mind perceive just the absence of those characteristics. So like if you were just resting in a kind of almost like an awareness that's not picking up any characteristics of anything, but still aware and perceiving the absence of those. So then he talks about how someone can get to that point, and then the last step, he says, is then they reflect that even that state is conditioned, even that state has been constructed through volition. Basically, that state of insight is constructed. And so that's it's kind of talking about the similar type of thing, but from the perspective of the meditation, the emptiness that we were talking about. So that's like the two angles on it. They're really the same, but they're kind of going at it from different points to get to that. Okay, and it looks like, yeah, okay. So we've reached the end of the questions. Perfect timing. Did I see a hand go? No, okay.
Oh.
Okay, one more question.
When we are speaking about human life and the gestation process of a child, and you say it's a lump of flesh. There is not yet consciousness, so it's not human, or it's not a being, it's not a creature. It's just a lump of flesh. And then when you think of abortion, and then if an abortion happened before, well, also how to know before there is consciousness, because in the medical world they say the consciousness only arrives like at 3 months, something like that. But then what happened before those 3 months? Is there moral implications to having an abortion when you are just relating to this like soil, like dirt, like how to think of something like that? Like, we are always talking about consciousness when we have a little child, or a little child only becomes a little child like in that 3 months when there is like neurons and whatever.
I'll let you answer this, but I just want to clarify.
Do you want to repeat the question for the?
Oh, okay, yeah. Which is, so the person is asking about abortion and what would be the implications of the different ideas on consciousness and the development of a child that were mentioned earlier. And I just wanted to clarify briefly that what I was saying is that if consciousness were not present, then it wouldn't be flesh. But in Buddhism, there's not actually a definition of when is it that consciousness arrives. But I should say there's not a consensus on when exactly does it go from being just the material there to turning into basically a developing organism. And like when exactly is that point reached? Is it immediate? Is it, and so, but the idea is that the Buddha says that in order for a child to develop, consciousness is present. If consciousness were to leave, then it would not develop. That's what I meant. If it were to leave, it would just be a lump of flesh. So I don't know, Venerable, if you
But to back up,
yeah.
But before we're talking about consciousness getting there, the Buddha is describing whether or not, if consciousness does not descend into that womb, name and form will not grow. Now let's look carefully at that implication. If consciousness does not descend into the womb, the question is to Ananda, would name and form, grow? No. So that has to mean name and form has to be there. Name and form is a sketch of name and form has to be there for consciousness to join it. Mm. So it's been described by Bhikkhu Nyanananda as like a rubber band. So if you think of it like name and form and consciousness are like two sheaves of reed. So here we are in this birth. Right now, we're here. We're leading our activities. We're doing our Dhamma studies. We're doing our best to try to understand the teachings of the Buddha, fully liberate ourselves, right? We're doing our best. But there are people who are not doing this. They're doing other things. You know, there was a sutta where there was a dog duty ascetic, and what was the other ascetic?
Cow duty.
The cow duty ascetic.
Ox duty.
Right?
Yeah.
They were engaged in practices that was like, one was acting like a dog and eating like a dog and rolling around like a dog, behaving like a dog. And someone asked the Buddha, Venerable Sir, what is his destination? So that being, because he's practicing and he's developing the habits, the name and form sketch of name and form, sort of like a sign at the end of life. You know, it's said that you get a sign or a nimitta of where you're going to be reborn. That sign, you know, that sign has been said to be like an image for consciousness, you know, a flash or an image for consciousness to join up. And if consciousness has been conditioned in this life through habits and practices, then it is like that rubber band. When it's released, they join at the moment of rebirth. But if consciousness has been trained, you know, we've got our sketch going in the next world. You know, maybe we've had some dog behavior, some cow behavior, some pig behavior, and you know, we've got the sketch of Namarupa sort of waiting. The architect is drawn the drawings, and the sketch is ready for the consciousness to join it up in the next life. But if we encounter the teachings of the Buddha, we develop faith, and we start training, we're taking the gradual path. We start training the mind to let go, let go, let go, let go. The consciousness begins to not become established. Then, what happens to the sketch? Consciousness doesn't descend. You know, it's like it takes the anidasana vijnana. It takes the signless as its object. It doesn't grab name and form anymore. That's what happens to the arahants. They don't grab. That grabbing habit, that anusia, finished. Whatever sketch may have been there, waiting. You know how in the sutras, it's like the disciples would come up to the Buddha and says, "Oh, Venerable Sir, what is so-and-so has been mauled by a cow or killed by some, what is his destination? Where is he going?" The Buddha could say, don't ask. Or he could tell them where he went, or the Venerable was wise and he didn't trouble me about the teachings of the Dhamma. He's realized, you know, non-returner or arahantship or whatever. He didn't grasp. So in the gradual training, what we're doing, you know, in these practices, just to, you know, to keep it really clear, it's really just he's teaching two things. He's really just teaching two things. 84,000 suttas. Two things. Suffering. What's the other one? End of suffering.
I like this point. Before we close on that, another thing I've been thinking about this, the similar thing that comes to mind is that there's as monks, we're not allowed to recommend people get abortion because it would be, I guess, considered a serious offense. But there's one place where the Buddha, someone asks him and they accuse him of being an abortion advocate. Yeah. And he says that there's one sense in which he does advocate abortion. And that is basically people not getting reborn. So like you practice so that you don't get reborn. So
you don't grab any name.
So you just like, yeah.
So we're doing it now. I mean, we're practicing. Believe it or not, this is what we're up to. you know, and whether we know it or not, you know, that's what we're doing. When we study the suttas, when we listen to the Dhamma, when we're asking questions about the Dhamma, we're keeping the sila, we're meditating, even though if we're falling asleep, you know, we're trying, we're doing our best. We're trying, essentially, to cut the sinews and the tendons, you know, like I talked this morning about the Nandakavada Sutta, where, you know, the internal flesh has been sort of cut and severed from the external hide. You know, I like to think, I could be wrong, but I like, for my own like skillful means, I like to think that whenever I see suffering, like for what it is, without the disguise, and the mind is able to see it and let it go, understanding, not with ignorance, not with pushing it away or, you know, trying to bypass it, but understand it, you know, and let it go with the clear insight into its nature. This has the nature to cease. This is not inherently enduring. It's impermanent. When that gets applied, when that happens, I like to think, I could be wrong, but I like to think that's like one snip, one sinew being chopped. And if we like just keep it up, like clip, 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 that the hide of the cow is being removed like a surgical incisions, like 50 bajillion connections. How long have we been in samsara? Developing these bonds and these fetters, these habits, this anusia, so long. But I just feel so inspired to think that every time suffering is understood even this much, and the cause is abandoned, that there's just a little moment of cessation. There's a little snip of sinews. And in that way, you know, we can encourage ourselves to keep going. You know, when we feel like, you know, it's just too much, or Nibbana is just so far away, or like, you know, I'm never going to get there, whatever that means. We can just take joy, take delight, as somebody asked a question earlier. Take delight in the fact that we made it. We have this human body. We finally get a human body. We're born in a territory that's not too problematic or too disturbed. You know, we have enough to eat. We're warm enough, safe enough. We're not crowded enough. I remember the future perils the Buddha talked about. You know, we have enough to practice, and so we, like our hair is on fire. We just keep at it. Keep at it.
All right, so we are at the end of our time, and maybe I'll say real quick for those who don't know the simile, because maybe they weren't listening. The simile of the cow being that the skin, you lay the skin after you cut it off on the cow, it's not attached anymore.
Yeah.
Even though it still looks like the skin is on there. Just for those who weren't maybe familiar with the simile. So
Venerable.
thank you, Venerable, for joining us, for sharing.
Quite an honor.
And thank you, everyone, for your enthusiasm. You know, if it was just us sitting here, then
we could keep talking. We go on and on.
We could be talking. But so I hope that you all have a good night, and you know, may you all not get reborn. And in the meantime, may you keep chipping away in a happy, joyful way.
You grow in blessings.
Yes. So I'm wishing you all the best, and we'll see you for any future live streams and events. Suki hoto.
Suki hoto.